Hey there, and welcome to You Talk. We chat with amazing people from across Canada and ask them about their stories, passions, and experiences. I'm your host, Ryan Funk. To raise awareness of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 Calls to Action, a collaboration between Reconciliation Thunder and Circles for Reconciliation, launched the 94 in 94 campaign. I sat down with Jimmy Thunder, Raymond Curry, and Grace Shedler from these two organizations to learn more about this social media campaign and what reconciliation looks like. It's awesome to meet all of you and to learn more about these organizations and this social media campaign that's going on. How about we just start with what is Circles for Reconciliation? Also, what is Reconciliation Thunder? So we'll start with Grace and Raymond, and then we'll go with you, Jimmy.
When the TRC came out with its initial report in June of 2015, the commissioners finished the preliminary report by saying that in the last paragraph that anyone who wants to do something about reconciliation, they don't have to wait till the final report comes out. And so I thought it was something that needed to be done. I was very moved by that call to action. And so I spent 9 months consulting Indigenous people. We've had far too much of action where we settlers have done things for or to Indigenous people instead of with Indigenous people. And so we started Circles after all this consultation for 9 months. We started with the premise that we would have a full and equal partnership. And we would have as our goal to build mutually respectful relationships. The commissioners say very early in the final report that as they went across the country, they heard all kinds of definitions of reconciliation, but they consider it to be creating and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. You can't do anything unless you respect each other. So that's what we tried to do. So those are the two pillars of our project. Partnership, equal partnership, with the goal of creating mutually respectful relationships. So our circles meet once a week for 10 weeks because it takes time to build relationships.
All right, Jimmy, what can you tell me about Reconciliation Thunder?
Reconciliation Thunder was initially started by me and my younger sister. And essentially what it comes down to is at one point in my life, I had to recognize that I needed to learn more about our history. And I was really curious about how the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country had gotten so bad. There was a point where I didn't know much of anything. I didn't know what the Indian Act was. I've never heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was going fresh. And so over time, I began to learn and just to ask the right questions, to study in school. And especially as I was going through my master's degree, really digging into taking courses on Indigenous economies, Indigenous economic development, and that type of thing. And I realized that there's a lot of people that have that same gap of knowledge, Indigenous and even non-Indigenous, but people like me who just didn't learn it as they were growing up. And so I started this organization. It's relatively new in terms of being launched. Like our website is coming out very soon, and essentially what this organization is, it's taking Indigenous consulting and sort of flipping it on its head. It's a nonprofit. We're creating high quality resources that teach some of these important fundamentals: the Truth and Reconciliation, Royal Commission report on Aboriginal peoples. The meaning of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the treaty relationship, a lot of these foundational things. So just taking that and sort of turning it on its head, creating these high quality resources, but instead of charging for it, as you might see in other firms. It's something that we just give out for free to the public for the mass use and mass distribution. And the goal would be that it's funded by grants or donations, people that see the value and just support. And then we just continue to create more resources. So it's relatively new, and so the goal is to really target and educate leaders, those who want to learn more about what they can do, and to try to get involved in making Canada a better place. And so we're a good partnership with Circles, because Circles is the in-person, real relationships than the dialogue, whereas ours is just more the background information, so just for people who want to do the self-study and self-learning and that type of thing, and learning online and learning through social media campaigns and that kind of thing. So it's a good pairing.
And one of those things that came out is this new 94 in 94 campaign. So what can you tell me about this? What is kind of the hopes to come out of this social media project?
We're delighted to be partners, and it fits very well with our mission and mandate. And so, but you go ahead and explain how this came about.
It was actually one of our volunteers that came up with the idea, and so just to give credit where it's due. But basically what it is, in terms of the hope, is at the end of May of this year, when there was the initial discovery of the 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC, there was a lot of people that were asking the question sincerely and genuinely, what can I do? Like, how can I help? What can I contribute? And a lot of people were not familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. And so we recognize, just being in the space that we are, that, here we are just years later, and a lot of people don't know what they are. And so this is sort of a good pairing of saying to people, look, if you want to help, the 94 calls to action is designed just for that. It's a great place to start. These are 94 calls that are meant for all people. A lot of people assume that the 94 calls are just for government, and especially if you've only read the first couple, because the first couple are directed to the government. But these are meant for all people in all segments of society, for everyone to have the chance to do something. And so the goal is that through this campaign, that we teach people that, these 94 calls to action exist, and these are concrete ways that you can contribute towards reconciliation in Canada.
Mm-hmm. I for myself, just seeing it, I was like, whoa, this is great, because I'm exactly in that boat. I had never read these 94 calls to action before. I knew they existed, but I just didn't know what they were. So this campaign is just a great way for everyday people to digest the information, because when you pull up a 20-page PDF and you're reading through them, you're like, oh, this is a little bit daunting. So I really like what is going on here.
The project also forced us to reflect on which calls to action Circles for Reconciliation is addressing. And we found that there are about 6 of the calls that we are directly addressing in the work that we do. And so it led us to reflect on that. And the main ones that our project focuses on are calls to action 45 and 46, which really deal with the creation and maintenance of respectful relationships. Former National Chief Perry Bellegarde said to business people, before you build anything, build a respectful relationship. And Mary Simon, the new Governor General, when she was appointed, one of the first things she said was, reconciliation is all about creating respectful relationships. It's just so basic and yet so essential.
So we can't go through all 94. It would take a long time. But what are some of the main components, you would say, and who would like to kind of tackle that?
As I answer that, I want to just recognize and appreciate Larissa Blumenshine. She's one of our volunteers. She's the one that designed all of our graphics. And so really, really like all of that. So far, she's done 54. She's going to do all 94. and she's put them all together, and it's a great way for us to summarize. So in these calls to action, there are actually 22 different categories, and for 22 different segments of society. And so so I think that's a good way of starting at, instead of looking at 94, you can start to look back and see these 22 categories, and you can see that there's some that are meant for the business community, there's some that are meant for church groups, there's some that are meant for the business sector, it's all segments of society. And so I think that's really helpful, and it's also good to look at just the summaries of each call. But in terms of, if you want to look at repetition and some of the fundamentals, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, that is mentioned in quite a few of these calls to action. And so what the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is, it's a declaration that was passed around about 2007. It was the result of years of work from Indigenous leaders from across the globe working together to set out the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide. And former Senator Murray Sinclair has often referred to this document as a roadmap for reconciliation. And recently, I think it's important to clarify the distinction between the current UNDRIP bill in Canada and UNDRIP, because there's a lot of communication and discussion on that bill. But in terms of UNDRIP, we're talking specifically about that resolution, and it's a really good step forward for our people. And when you look at the 94 calls to action, it's referred to again and again. It's in call to action 92 for the business community. It's given as a framework for teaching and for training. When you look at the church parties to the settlement agreement, it's used as a framework for the education strategies for your congregation, and so on. So that it's one of the themes that is repeated a lot. Another thing is the treaty relationship. There's a lot of times when some of these calls to action, they'll have a lot of subpoints. It's important to recognize the treaty relationship that Canada entered into treaty relationship after Confederation, known as the number treaties. There's also Confederation treaties, and recognizing what that nation-to-nationship agreement means. It's in there. It's in these 94 calls to action, and a number of other themes, anti-racism, and really just a lot of it is education, and a lot of it is action, and it's I mean, I'm trying to give you a summary here without telling you it's all in here, but the thing is, they're 94. They're meant to simplify, but there actually is quite a bit of work that went into it. Justice Sinclair, at the time, he also was part of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which gave us 231 recommendations, and so these 94 calls to action draw from that, and there's over 4,000 pages in the final report that are summarized in these 94 calls. So it's really a starting point. I think a good thing to say is that these are not 94 things. There's not a list of 94 that says once you check off all these things, then we're done reconciliation. It's solving the problem of reconciliation is so big and complex. Where do we even start? And so I think that's a good way to look at these 94 calls.
Whenever it comes to like social movements, social improvements, just that progressive ideology, that there's never a point where things are just, oh, we're good. Let's stop here. It's all about developing and growing. So yeah, like you mentioned, going through these 94. Oh, awesome. These are great. Well, now what are the next steps? Always moving forward. And I mean, unfortunately, when there is any social movement or development, there is some pushback on things, as we've seen with the here in Winnipeg, when the statue of the Queen was pulled down, just the division that was caused. Maybe more people are on the side of Indigenous communities than against, but it's very polarizing, at least on social media. Following up with that, what can we do as communities? a lot of these things, not just for government, not just for business, but us as individuals. What are some of the best things we can do on an individual basis, grow these communities together of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous?
Well, let me give you one example of, first of all, it's important to note these are calls to action. These are not recommendations. And the commissioners make this point. It's an action they want, not just we recommend that something be done and the recommendation sits on a shelf. These are calls to action. So let me give you one example of how we've taken this call to action about education. One of the calls to action asks for the parents of children to be involved in the education of their children. So we're starting circles. We have a partnership with 2 large school divisions in Winnipeg, and we're going to be offering circles in September in these school divisions where the parents will come to the school in the evening to take part in a 10-week circle. So here you have 10 people, 5 Indigenous, 5 non-Indigenous from a given school, and these parents will now be able to go home and talk to their kids about what they're learning in school about reconciliation, and the parents will be involved in the education of their children, which is explicitly one of the calls to action of the commission.
Like you mentioned before, Raymond, the project has seen an increase in people wanting to participate, which is great to see. People wanting to learn and take part and address issues within our systems to make a better society for everyone. So it's 10 weeks. Grace, do you want to maybe tell us what these circles look like and what that 10-week program all encompasses?
We usually have a total of 12 people in the circle. We've been doing them on Zoom because we haven't been able to do in-person circles. So we have 1 Indigenous, 1 non-Indigenous facilitator, and we try and balance with 5 Indigenous, non-Indigenous people in the circle. We have 15 themes that are listed in our Facebook page, but we usually only use 10 of those themes because it's only 10 weeks. So we usually start off with, of course, like at the beginning of the circle, after everybody has introduced themselves and where they're from and why they are in the circle, is we usually start off with the land acknowledgement, the 7 teachings of the Anishinaabe. We offer smudging if it's in person. And then they also do smudging in their own areas in Zoom. I always make sure that I do smudge prior to a Zoom circle. And then we have we use a talking stick if we are in person. But as you know, everything has to be done on Zoom, and we want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak. So we usually use the we just number everybody in those circles so that they have a chance to speak. And of course, it's only an hour and a half. So we try and limit the amount of time that everybody has to speak, right? Because we want everybody to have that chance. But on occasion, if somebody doesn't talk a lot or has not much, doesn't really contribute a lot because they're too busy listening, sometimes when they do have something to say, we make sure that that person has that time to say what's on their mind. So it usually takes about by the fifth circle is when people start getting comfortable with each other. It takes a while to start getting to know and feel safe in that circle, which we always make sure as facilitators that we tell them that it's a safe place to say what's on their mind, because we want to make sure that we understand where we are coming from, like both the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous side. So then after we cover those themes, then the 10th week, then we usually just close off as, well, maybe about the 7th or 8th or 9th session, we ask the circle what they would prefer, because sometimes they want to cover different themes than what's suggested on the list. So then we have time to talk about those. And then at the end of that, then we just close off with the visions of the Truth and Reconciliation.
What is the best way to kind of move forward? If we do all these 94 calls to action, what would the next steps be, or any thoughts on that? I'm just curious. What does that complete unity look like? Because we don't have that right now.
So the best the call to action, like I have a list of numbers like 1 to 94 on my choices. And the one I have is we call upon all levels of government to educate public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples. So I think that's really important. And I think that that is one call to action that I'm going to be working on for sure. But on the other hand, when I look at when it says levels of government to educate public servants, it doesn't only have to be public servants, like Jimmy said. It can be any organization. But the problem, I shouldn't say problem. What reconciliation looks like to me is that, yeah, we can have the 5 Indigenous, 5 non-Indigenous, we can have all these circles. But until the leaders, Indigenous leaders in those communities, reconcile with their own communities, is the healing going to even start more, right? So I think that the reconciliation needs to start in the communities before it even branches out into the non-Indigenous environment or communities or whatever.
I also think that sometimes, like when we talk about reconciliation, it's very huge and it's very complex, because some of the challenge up to this point is for people have difficulty realizing how the historical context, it shapes where we are today. A lot of people try to disregard history, the generations that passed, but it's all part of the same story, from contact until now. And so, we talk about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, for example. I mean, it's foundational. It's older than Canada, and it is really a guiding post for Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations from that point forward. And so, I mean, I'm referencing to it, and I don't think we have time to get too much into what it is. It's a unilateral proclamation that later had to be ratified by a treaty the next year in 1764. The point that I'm trying to make is, though, I mean, to your question, you're asking, so if we get all these 94 done, then what's the next step? So I think it's important to note that some of these calls can be done, quickly in short order. Some of them maybe 1 to 5 years. Some of them can be decades. Some of them are written that we can be working on this for a long time. A good quote from Murray Sinclair that I like is that if it took us, 150 years to get here, then it might take us 150 more. I think you might have said if it took 7 generations, it might take 7 generations more. It's just to recognize the scope of the problem. It's very big, and so, but still, it does, in terms of understanding, that's still a difficult question though. Like, people want to know, so what does reconciliation look like when it's done? And so the most helpful explanation that I could probably give to that is, let's start by imagining a world where reconciliation wasn't needed. So imagine that we went about this the right way from the very beginning. So imagine that all of the treaties, the pre-Confederation treaties, were met, they're respected and remembered, annually visited. Imagine that when Canada was making treaties, they did it in the exact same way that they were making agreements with the colonies. So when the colonies and the provinces were joining Confederation, they did it in a way that respected the individual culture and the language of those groups. And so their self-determination was preserved. So imagine we did the same thing with the treaties. I also imagine that, there was no Indian Act, so there was no unilateral policy of individual assimilation. So that would mean that there would be no residential schools, there would be no peasant farming policy, there would be no policies against practicing your culture, there'd be no policies against having lawyers, and basically Indigenous economies would continue to grow in their own way. So culture doesn't remain in a vacuum, culture shifts and grows. So look, for example, at South Korea, for example, they're still their distinct culture, but they're not the way that they were 200 years ago. So they shifted and they grow with time. So imagine that something like that happened with Indigenous peoples here. And so imagine that with the Métis people that Canada, made agreements and purchased land from them rather than from the Hudson's Bay Company. Imagine that the Inuit people were not forcibly relocated and had their culture taken from them. So all these different things, right? So if you imagine all these things, so then there wouldn't be a huge amount of Indigenous people incarcerated. There wouldn't be a residential school legacy. There wouldn't be intergenerational trauma. There wouldn't be a high degree of Indigenous people in child welfare. There wouldn't be huge disparities of just the social determinants of health between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. All these different things would be gone because we would have done it right the first time. And so when we start to imagine a world that looks like that, where reconciliation is not needed, then that helps us to recognize that. So reconciliation will start to be done when the world that we see today starts to look a little bit more like that type of a world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Please stop me if I'm wrong, but my thoughts on this, and I am new to learning about Indigenous cultures and communities, had no interactions with Indigenous or First Nations individuals really before. But what I've been learning from just the culture and especially the 7 sacred laws, I don't know, they kind of speak to me, not in a spiritual level, but just in the aspects of what we can see in life and just go through life and just acknowledging the world around us. I would love to see a much more combined aspect of society of Indigenous culture and Western. Like, I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, but I think a more unified, and since Canada is so multicultural, we should be taking aspects of all of this to apply to society. And I feel in terms of multiculturalism, our Indigenous communities are often left out of the equation, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think, and this is, I think that's a good thing for Grace to speak to here, because when we talk about the 7 sacred teachings, it's an aspect of Indigenous law. And I think it's important to create a distinction between Indigenous law and what's called Aboriginal law, because Aboriginal law, that's a branch of Canadian government that deals with Aboriginal peoples, right? And so, but with Indigenous law, that's our law. That's the law that's been governing our societies and our different nations on Turtle Island since time immemorial. And so, the 7 sacred teachings, like, that's a component of that. But law is it's something that has been guiding us for centuries. And the justice is that we have, that we understand, is very restorative and it's holistic, and it respects all of nature. And so if we were to, like I said, if I was to go back and look at how Canada would look today, it'd be, in terms of how we understand law, I think that Canada would be in a much better place. Now, I don't know if Grace, if you can speak further to that, because you have a bit of a background in that.
I think you summed it up pretty damn good, Jimmy. But yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like, it's not, I don't have any more to add to that.
I think we shouldn't forget that reconciliation is a process more than an end goal. And I think we have to take a long-term or a long view of history. It's only in the last part of the 20th century that we have focused so much on human rights. We used to let nations treat their people the way they wanted, and we would never interfere with another nation. Now, a nation that is persecuting its own people is called to account by the rest of the countries of the world. We're not always effective in doing it, but we're addressing the issue that everybody has a right to a decent life and to respect and dignity. And that wasn't the case 100 years ago. So, and we're very impatient. At the same time, we have reason to be because of the tremendous injustices. But there's a sociological term called a revolution of rising expectations. And what it refers to is once people begin to realize they have a right to respect, then they demand it. And so when you get more demonstrations or more demands, that doesn't mean we're going backwards. It means that finally we're realizing the injustices and we're impatient to make sure that we follow through. And if there's one other thing I'm grappling with is what really worries me today is the tendency we have to put down absolutely every organization. And in a sense, we have a right to do so and an obligation to do so, because the moral authority of virtually every organization is being questioned today. Who is satisfied with the way government is behaving? Who is satisfied with the way churches are behaving? Who is satisfied the way professional sports is behaving? You know, there's hardly a moral compass that draws us in and we can turn to and say, lead us to better reconciliation. So I think we have to be less critical of the mistakes that we all make and look at the good things that we're doing in terms of promoting reconciliation so we can really move forward. I'm inspired every day by what we hear in our circles from people who really want to have a better world.
Yeah, that's my hope to see. Definitely in Indigenous communities, we need to provide access to resources, clean drinking water, all these things that are considered human rights by the UN, like shelter, water. We need to provide those. And Canada is a wealthy country. We have the resources to do so. We just need to do it. And I would love to see that once everyone has, equal access to education, resources, then we can start moving forward in a positive way. And at least in my opinion, I see for those who are reluctant to acknowledge these problems and the systemic racism within Western society. I mean that racism is an issue worldwide, but at least here in Canada, that when you criticize a government or an institution, they take it as a criticism on themselves. I feel sometimes, which shouldn't necessarily be the case, whereas the actions of a government is, different than the actions of an individual. That's just my thoughts.
I just really want to agree with the theme of being solution focused, and I think there's a good differentiation between cancel culture and just accountability, so I think we have to have a healthy look on that, a solutions focused look on that, and how we can make things better, and so I agree, sometimes differentiating the actions of individuals versus a government can be difficult sometimes, but I just echoing Raymond's sentiment, I think it's important. I know things, let's be solution focused. Let's focus on where we agree, because I think that's when we start to get movement, is when we focus on those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I believe at the end of the day, everyone wants people to be happy and healthy. It just sometimes takes a little bit to break down some of those culture or systemic barriers.
It's so true, and I think a lot of it too is information gaps. I think for so many generations, just not recognizing how we got to where we are. It's so important. You were talking about how there's money and resources to meet people's needs. It's absolutely true. I have a master's degree in business administration, and one thing that I think is interesting as I look at the Indian Act and different policies, instead of, as I mentioned earlier, when Canada was making agreements with the colonies and the provinces, there was an agreement for self-determination and the division of powers. That's why we have federalism in our government. But with Indigenous groups, it was it was assimilation as individuals. Like, yeah, you can join Canada, but as individuals, not as nations. And so their economies were stifled, like there was the pass system, the permit system, and all these different things. I would recommend people to check out. There's a really good book called The 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, and just really look at how the Indian Act has stifled one specific economy, which otherwise would have been self-determining and self-supporting. And then you turn around and you point at them for, these misinformation, such as these myths that we collect their tax dollars, So at the end of the day, just looking at that was a cost to everyone, just diminishing Indigenous people's self-determination. That's a huge cost. That's we would all be better off if we had the ability to have our economies grow strong and to contribute, the way that we would naturally would have otherwise, So it's, again, when we look at solution focused, like, it's when Indigenous people win, we all win together,
Between Circles of Reconciliation and Reconciliation Thunder, what are other services or initiatives or programs are available for people to learn more about these 94 calls to action about reconciliation?
I can mention a couple and then I'll pass it over to Raymond. I think that I would really recommend the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba for those who are listening from Manitoba. It's really, really important to understand what our treaty relation is. They have a great campaign called We Are All Treaty People, because we're all beneficiaries of the treaties. We're all descended of the nations, that signed these nation-to-nation agreements. So the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, for those who are in Saskatchewan, there's the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, does the same thing. But we also, there's also plans in place potentially to have a national treaty commissioner across Canada. So that might be coming. That's something to watch out for. Also, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and the great work that they are doing. It's really important to follow them. And if you are for the corporate sector, there's Indigenous corporate training. Look at what Bob Joseph is doing. Great work, great articles, great blogs. And if you are an organization that really wants to follow through with these 94 calls to action and to make a public declaration that you are doing so, Winnipeg has an Indigenous Accord, and it's voluntary. You can jump in, you can sign up, you can make, you can just, as an organization, you could make a declaration that you're going to follow such and such call to action and then report on it annually. So those are some that I would recommend. I don't know, Raymond or Grace, if you have more.
I can recommend no books. I can recommend that you visit some of these communities and maybe try and spend a week or two in them and see how well a person can survive it up there, because there are no hotels for you. There are no restaurants for you. The food prices are ridiculous. So, and a lot of the people that live in these northern communities, especially the fly-in communities, the food prices, jobs, of course, is their major concern. So reconciliation is something that's really last on their list. Survival is number one. So I think that if anybody's really serious about helping Indigenous people, I would say visit these communities and spend a week or two there, learn the community, what's dynamics, what the word would be, and see how these people live, and start there. Because if you're just gonna stay in Winnipeg in your own bubble and assume that you know what's happening in those communities just by reading whatever somebody else writes, you're not gonna know the real struggles of the people. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, meeting people can go a long way, because you humanize them. Then you see that they are an individual, whatever their life story, whatever they're going through, you can then relate to it and empathize with them. Because, otherwise it's just a story on the media.
We're creating partnerships with First Nations where half of our 10 meetings would be on First Nations and half would be in an adjoining town. For example, half at Roseau River Anishinaabe First Nation and half in Altona so that there's a link between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We're also hoping to organize visits to the National Indian Residential School Museum in Portage Prairie. It's one of two in Canada, and our participants, we think, should visit the museum and get a real hands-on sense of the history of residential schools. So we're going to be encouraging that. And I'm very impressed with Cindy Blackstock. And, you know, at a conference back in 2015 in Winnipeg, she said, now that we know so much, why don't we do better? You know, I mean, that's really the call to action, isn't it? That there was a national survey of the attitudes of non-Indigenous people toward Indigenous people done by Environics Institute. And they classified people according to two characteristics. How much do you know and how much do you care? People who know a lot about our history in relationship to Indigenous people and really care about improving the situation formed about 18% of the population. But those who didn't know much and couldn't care less were 21%. And then there was a whole bunch who cared but didn't know much. And those are the ones we really want to capture. They care, and there's more and more Canadians who care. Reconciliation efforts are really mobilizing a lot. You know, when we appeared on CBC talking about our circles, there were 110,000 Facebook hits from that one program. And the message that came across was, I want to get involved in reconciliation. I don't know how. I'm afraid of making a mistake, and your project looks like a good solution. So it's the people who care but don't know much that we really need to focus on, so that we get this momentum and these calls to action which are acted on.
Fantastic. Well, this was a great conversation. I felt I learned a lot, and there's still more conversations to have. But where can people find out more information about these two organizations?
Well, our websites, both of the websites are very easily accessible. Circles4reconciliation.ca. All one word, circles4reconciliation.ca. And Jimmy, yours is?
Yeah, reconciliationthunder.org. Word reconciliation, thunder.org.
Are there any leaving words or ending words that any of you would like to share?
I guess I would conclude. I just want to echo Raymond's thoughts on the research that was done by the Environics Institute. It's the Canadian Public Opinion on Aboriginal Peoples, and it was released on 2016. So encourage people to look into that, because I think that's a great focus. The category he's talking about on the survey is called the Young Idealist, and that's where we focus on as well for us. I think that in terms of final words, there's one of the words that I really appreciate by former Senator Murray Sinclair was the fact that he says we're all leaders. You know, every single one of us, you know, we all lead, and we may not see it that way, and we may not know it that way, but we all lead, especially considering we're all family. You know, we all have families. So maybe you're leading your brothers, your children, you know, that kind of a thing. But essentially, when we think of, you know, his other quote, that reconciliation cannot be left like there. One of my favorite quotes is that he says the reconciliation cannot be left up to the governments, the courts, and the churches alone. Reconciliation needs to take place across all sectors of Canadian society. And so when we put those two quotes together, like, we're all leaders, we all have a part in this, we all can do something, we're all empowered to do something, and really we all need to do something. It needs to happen all across all sectors of society and in all communities across Canada. And so that's something that I would like to leave with everyone to think we all are leaders, we all can do something, and we all should do something.
We finish every one of our circles with the statement from the commission: reconciliation begins with each and every one of us.
I guess when we hear a lot about Murray Sinclair and his quotes, like he done the AJI as well, back in I forget the year, and then working with the Truth and Reconciliation circles, he had traveled across Canada. So he is extremely well informed by visiting all those communities and learning. Plus, he was a judge. I had it when I started as a court worker in justice. He was the judge that worked at the youth center when I started there. So we had a few conversations, and I got to know him a little bit through his work as a judge and then as a federal judge, sorry. I forget it. And then he went on to be something else and then something else. He's quite an important individual. But he did learn a lot of what he states from visiting all those communities. He didn't just learn that on his own, right? So he did a lot of work. So I really think that if anything is going to happen, that people need to do the same type of work that Murray Sinclair did. You need to visit these communities. You need to talk to the people. You need to hear from them. You need to hear what they have to say, right? And you can't cut them off when they're speaking. You have to listen to them.
If you have any stories you'd like us to share or communities we should highlight, leave a comment on our social media or reach out to us on our website. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.